Let's talk about the process to publish a manuscript in a peer-reviewed journal. So first off, it's important to recognize there's different categories of manuscripts or papers. And each category has value. They're different. And it's important to recognize the similarities and the differences that exist between these different types of manuscripts or types of literature. The first type of literature is the lay literature, general literature. These are your magazines, your Sports Illustrated, Shape, Reader's Digest, Runner's World, what have you. The way I think of it is if it's a glossy picture and a glossy article and it looks neat and fun to read, that's probably a general or lay literature. To publish in this type of journal, typically if I was going to write an article for Runner's World, for example, I would write the article and I'd send it to the editor, and the editor would consider it and then maybe make some edits or some suggestions, and I work with that editor to refine the article, and ultimately the editor makes a decision to publish or not. And it's written for generally an audience that is lay, that does not have a technical understanding of some information. And so it's written in a way that's sort of catchy and fun to read, and informative nonetheless. And I find that these articles are often very helpful to our research in that it gives us a sense of what the community is talking or what people are talking about regarding some topic. So if you find an article in a journal like this, don't discount it. In fact, it may actually be helpful to refine hypotheses or questions that you may have that you want to answer through a research process. But nonetheless, when we write a manuscript and we develop the ideas behind the manuscript, we do not use the general literature as evidence for a hypothesis or against a hypothesis. It's more of a idea generating type of literature. The two categories of articles that I want to talk about in more detail, and really I'm going to only talk about the primary research article going forward here, is the primary research article and a secondary source or a secondary article. Let me jump down to the secondary source one. What this is a manuscript that is peer-reviewed, published in a peer-reviewed journal. And what the authors have done is they've taken a lot of literature on a particular topic and then wrote sort of a summary of all that literature and how all those different primary sources sort of add up to a particular message. These are very important bodies of work. And if you are doing a project on a particular topic and you come across a literature review or a secondary source review, they become very valuable because that helps sort of identify primary sources, but it also helps provide an interpretation of primary sources. Primary sources aren't written for everybody. They're written for, and I'll talk more about this, but they're written for the scope of readership of a particular journal. And that readership may be a really narrow scope of people. And so sometimes the articles are hard to really pick out the information. And so secondary sources, lit reviews, can be helpful in interpreting primary sources. So if you find a secondary source, that's excellent. Use that to find primary sources, look at their reference list, and then look at how they interpret the information from that primary source. But for a lot of the work that we're doing and building the idea behind a research project, we want to rely on primary sources. And so a primary research article is also a peer-reviewed article published in a peer-reviewed journal. I'll explain that in just a bit. It could also be a conference proceeding, and not all conference proceedings are peer-reviewed. Some are and some are not. However, the primary article could still be a conference proceeding. It could be an abstract that's published in a journal as well. Not all abstracts are peer-reviewed, but all three of these represent ideas that are original and an experiment conducted by the authors listed on the abstract, proceeding, or manuscript. Now, what we are ultimately going to find is that the peer-reviewed journal article is sort of our key publication that we're going to find and that we would list in our reference list of a project or thesis or professional paper or dissertation. These are papers that the authors describe an experiment that they conducted and the results of that experiment. You'll find, and you'll see, and I'll talk about it some more, the peer review process can take a year, maybe 2 years, maybe even longer to get an article published. And so conference proceedings and abstracts sometimes can be valuable in terms of looking at current work that's being done. So if I'm looking for work that's being done this year, I may actually look at conference proceedings and abstracts that are published in journals. And that can sometimes tell me what the cutting edge work is. However, I don't include these types of primary sources when the conference proceedings or the abstracts were published back maybe 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. If those conference proceedings and abstracts never transition to manuscripts, the value of those abstracts and conference proceedings goes down. And the value of current abstracts and proceedings just has to be taken very cautiously because these types of articles may not be peer reviewed. And so the article and the results may not have fully been vetted. However, sometimes we'll use these to identify current work that is being done in a particular area. All right, so now what I want to do is talk about the research manuscript that ultimately is published in a peer-reviewed journal. And so that's really my focus. So first off, it's important to understand the structure of a manuscript. Every manuscript pretty much will have an abstract, that the abstract can be searched and found through different search engines. And then there will be the body of the paper. Now, whenever you list a reference in your reference list of a paper, you always want the full, complete article. You do not want to rely on just the abstract. The abstract is a very condensed version of what's in the manuscript, and it can be very valuable to get some key points. But at the end of the day, you need the full manuscript, and you will need to have read the full manuscript in order to cite it in your paper. And a manuscript will have these different sections, typically. An introduction, which describes why the experiment was done. It should have a clear purpose statement. Let me put that in here. And it may have identified some hypotheses or some hypothesis, a statement the authors believe to be true based upon what they know before they conducted the experiment. All right. Then there will be the methods section, which will explain the design of the experiment, will explain the population, the instruments used, the procedures or what subjects were asked to do, when data were collected. And then it will also describe some data reduction, where we take these big data sets and reduce them down to the dependent and independent variables. And then also describe the statistical analyses used to analyze the data. All right, and that's a very nuts and bolts type of chapter and really explains the experiment itself. And then the next section will be the results section, which is an objective presentation of the outcome of the measures. And so there should not be a section where there's discussion. This should be the section where the data are presented and really an objective analysis is presented to the reader. This is where you determine, things like this dependent variable was influenced or was not influenced by this independent variable, and then you list the statistical outcome. And in this section, you really follow the statistical rules that are established for comparing two groups of numbers or multiple groups of numbers. And then finally, we get to the discussion section. And in that discussion section, the authors tell the reader what their interpretation of the results is or are. And there's a nice format to follow for a discussion. You usually look for the opening paragraph to describe the most important information that the experiment yielded. Then the authors compare their data typically to other published public manuscripts, and in essence establish that the data are reasonable. And then they go through a critical review or analysis of their experiment. They identify limitations, maybe identify confounding factors, and then eventually they get to a point where they provide more of an interpretation of what the data and the results really mean in their perspective. And then finally a conclusion. So a lot wrapped up into that discussion section, but they can be very valuable. Now, I should say not all journals follow the same format. Sometimes they have different headers, but in essence, these are the components that make up a research manuscript. And what's important also is you do not need to read the manuscript from the very first line to the very last line in the discussion section. Sometimes you jump around. Sometimes you look at the results and then you go back and look at the introduction and maybe then the methods. Or sometimes you're interested in the methods and then you go and look at the results and what have you. You can jump around. Some of these sections are written in what I call a compartment, that they stand alone, if you will, in terms of the information that they contain. However, if you include this reference within your body of work, you cite it, you will need to have read the entire paper. You can't skip around and just cherry pick information from a paper, because sometimes it's easy to take something out of context without knowing some other parts of the manuscript. But you do not need to read this as you would a book, or start at page 1 and end where the last page is. All right, so now let me tell you a little bit about the peer review process and why these types of manuscripts are valuable. Well, first off, if I conducted the experiment, did the analysis, ultimately I'm going to write the manuscript. All right. Then what I do is I identify a target journal: Medicine and Science and Sports Exercise, Journal of Applied Biomechanics, Strength and Conditioning, whatever the journal is, European Journal of Applied Physiology, International Journal of Exercise Science, whatever the journal is. All right, I'm going to identify that target journal. There's some different things that come into play when identifying that target journal. One is the impact factor, how well read that journal is. And the impact factor, in essence, tells us how other researchers are accessing the information in that journal. Now, some new journals may not have a high impact factor at all. Some well-established journals will have a high impact factor, but nevertheless, it's a number, it's a value that we can assign to a journal and gives us a sense of how well read that journal is. And sometimes we target high impact factor journals, and sometimes we look at mid-range or maybe even lower impact factor journals, all depending on the situation and the type of paper we're dealing with. The other thing that we look at is the scope of work the journal publishes. So if you look at a journal homepage, a web page, it will have a description of the types of papers that they publish. Gait and posture, for example, is very clinically orientated. So your manuscript has to target some clinical message. Strength and Conditioning Journal publishes more applied work, and and they have a very clear section on practical application. How does this paper help a coach, an athlete, or practitioner relative to something human performance related? So when you have that understanding of the scope of work of the journal, that might help identify what journal to target, or you include information in your manuscript that addresses the scope of work that the journal publishes. Some other things that we do consider when picking a journal is cost of publication. Some publications charge what we call a page charge, or sometimes an open access charge. And those charges can sometimes be really nominal, maybe $75. And sometimes they can be quite expensive, $2,000, $3,000 to publish an article. And so that is something that we look at when we are considering a journal. We also look at the review time. Is the journal quarterly? Does it publish monthly? How quickly is how quick does the review process happen? And red flags go up. If the review process is really short, that's not very rigorous. If the review process is really, really long, well, we sometimes need to make decisions whether or not we want this paper to hit publication in a certain time window. And so those are things that we look at when we are considering journals. Once we've identified that target journal, then we have to format the manuscript to whatever the journal rules are or the guidelines. And so they always have instructions for authors. I should put that in here. Instructions for authors. And that, in essence, tells you all the rules you need to follow. If you don't follow the rules, the journal won't even consider it. And it's happened. I've had manuscripts go in to a journal, and the editor identified some rules weren't followed and just sent it back and said, sorry, we're not going to consider it, and because these are the rules that we need you to follow. So some of the rules include, and this is actually really important, is a blind copy of the manuscript. The review process is strongest, many of us think, when the review process is blind. That means if I'm an author, I don't know who the peer reviewers are. And likewise, the peer reviewers do not know who the authors are. So that blind perspective is helpful to the review process in that it sort of helps remove at least one level of bias that there may be, that someone says, oh, this person's so well published, they must be right. Or vice versa, oh, this person is not well published, this must not be very good. And so now you run into a bias within the review process if you know the authors, if you're the reviewer. And likewise, if author gets reviewer comments back and knows the reviewer, that there may be a bias from the reviewer perspective, from the author perspective, about that the reviewer may have. And so then it can turn into a rather unproductive exercise of making revisions to a manuscript or contesting revisions that ultimately are recommended. So anyways, the blind review process is actually really a cornerstone to to the strength of peer-reviewed manuscripts. You don't have any identifiers. In fact, often when I work with grad students that are submitting a paper for the first time, we usually have to scrub the manuscript for anything that mentions UNLV, whether that's an address or sometimes when we talk about the IRB, we sometimes write in the university name there, and we have to really watch for any identifiers, or sometimes if the subject population gets really specific to a group on campus or some university, we have to really be careful about keeping the manuscript blind. The instructions for authors will also identify the reference style to be used, APA, AMA, or some other type of reference system, and we just need to modify the format based on whatever the journal uses. And then we have to format the figures, the tables, however the journal does it, we need to follow those rules. And sometimes it's quality of the figure, or figures aren't embedded in the manuscript, they're at the end of the manuscript or what have you. But in essence, the rules that we need to follow, we need to follow them. We break the rules, the paper doesn't get published or even considered for publication. All right, so let's say we get the manuscript formatted for the journal. What we then do is submit the manuscript via the portal or journal portal. And this right now is all done electronically. Back when I started, it was done via paper. We would print up the paper, we would send multiple copies of the paper to the journal editor via mail, snail mail. That's no longer the case. So it's now, it's all electronic. So we submit through an electronic portal. Once the manuscript is submitted, the editor then reviews the manuscript. And the editor may just decline the manuscript at that point, saying, oh, it's not really within the scope of the journal, or maybe there's some type of experimental flaw that the editor identifies and basically says, we're not going to consider this. Thank you for writing, but please go to another journal. And that happens. It's not unheard of. If the editor does consider the manuscript for publication, then the editor sends out the paper, the manuscript, to 2, maybe 3 reviewers. These reviewers are peer reviewers. And they are other people who do similar type of research. The editor identifies them and then sends the reviewer a request to review, and that person will look at the title, maybe look at the abstract, and then say, yes, I can do this, this is in my area, or no, this is not in my area, or no, I don't have time, I can't do a thorough review, what have you. But at the end of the day, the editor will identify 2 or 3 peers doing similar type of research to review the manuscript. The manuscript gets sent to the reviewers, and then they go through the manuscript and then provide feedback. And they provide feedback in the form of general comments, sort of big picture type of issues, to specific comments. They identify a line number on a certain page, and they have a question about something that's written. These reviews can include comments that take up 1 to 2, 3 pages. That review from each reviewer is then communicated back to the editor. The editor then looks at the review and then decides, I'm not even going to consider this anymore, and will send the author a decision to decline and end the review process at that point. It may not even send the reviewer comments back to the authors. I'm going out of order here. But the editor could, once reviewing those comments from the reviewers, could say, oh, this is great, we're going to accept it as is. That hardly ever happens, but it could happen. Could be that the manuscript is really well written, well understood, well received by the reviewers, and no edits are necessary. Typically, manuscripts are sent back with at least minor revisions. And those may be acronyms that are unfamiliar to the reader, maybe spell them out. Maybe it's quality of the figures, it's things that are not critical to the experiment, or introducing some flaw, or, there's no real debate in terms of interpretation of the results. So really minor type of comments to address. The authors will address those comments, send them back, and then the review process continues, and the editor sends those comments, the revised manuscript, back out to the reviewers. The reviewers look at how the comments were addressed, and then send the editor back feedback again. And the feedback could be, hey, great, they addressed all my concerns. I vouch for publishing in the journal. It could be, well, maybe this raised some additional questions. And then the review process continues. Those questions and comments are sent back to the authors, and then they respond, revise the manuscript, respond to the reviewer comments. And typically this may happen 2, maybe 3 times at most. If it goes beyond 3 times, the editor will typically reject the manuscript at that point, because there's something happening that just is not connecting to getting that manuscript right for the journal. But it is an iterative process, even for minor revisions. The editor could also send the manuscript back with major revisions, but the opportunity to submit or resubmit. And so these are questions about the interpretation of the results, or maybe the reviewers have questions about how the experiment was conducted. Maybe they identify potential confounding factors. These are major things to deal with, not just copy editing type of things, not just simple questions. Wait, was that a greater than or less than sign on line 192, whatever it is. These are major revisions and really require some good thought from the authors. But again, that process will continue. Their authors will address the comments. Maybe they withdraw the paper if they don't feel they can address the comments, but typically they'll try to address the comments, make revisions to the paper, resubmit to the editor. The editor sends it back out to the reviewers. The reviewers review that revised manuscripts, and that process continues. Again, it's an iterative process. It goes around maybe 2, maybe 3 times. 3rd time, it's most likely going to get rejected by the editor at that point, that there just is no pathway to publish this paper, even with the effort that's been put in by the reviewers and the authors at that point. And then finally, the editor can decide to reject the paper at any time. as I started off saying, even after the first review, the editor may just outright reject the paper and saying there's too many flaws or this just is not the right scope for this journal. So the idea here is that this vetting of a manuscript is a process where people of similar research expertise and knowledge are making sure this paper is meeting some standards to publish. All right, that there is a process here for that, and it can be quite extensive. And so, so here, after 2 to 3 revisions, eventually the manuscript hopefully will be accepted for publication, and then we can say it's in press. And so you may actually be coming across references that have in press instead of a year. That just simply means the editor has decided to accept the manuscript in its most recent version for publication. Once that happens, that manuscript is then sent to a copy editor. And so there's still more work here. The copy editor then makes a thorough review of what the paper looks like in essence. It looks for spelling errors. It may look for reference citation number errors. It may look for certain formatting errors, things like that. And may even add some grammar to certain sentences and communicate with the author at that point in terms of what the paper looks like. Eventually, the manuscript will be ready for publication, and then what is created is what's called page proofs. This is a reproduction of what the manuscript will look like once it is published. So it looks like it's in 2-column format, the figures are placed in the right place, things like that. These page proofs are sent to the first author or the communicating author, and then the author has usually only about 48 hours to turn it around, to check off and to let the editor know that it's ready for publication. And it's worth checking because we have had journals or manuscripts that we have caught incorrect information that got translated from what we had written to the final version. So sometimes asterisks over certain areas in a figure, or greater than or less than sign, or things that ended up getting switched in some part of the process. So it really is important for the authors to do a quick review. And eventually the manuscript is published and shows up and it's citable and searchable and all that. So the point of going through this is peer-reviewed journals are vetted and a very rigorous process. And journals that have higher impact factors typically are also vetted very thoroughly because they have a high readership and it's a very rigorous process. So there's a lot of value in these, as opposed to me working with the Runner's World editor to come up with a paper based on my ideas, not being peer reviewed, not being reviewed by another person that does similar work to me. Maybe it's reviewed by the editor, but that editor may not have the same level of expertise as this research area. And this is different than a secondary source, which is written about other papers, other primary sources. So as we go through building a project or understanding a project, having primary sources is really important. And having primary sources from peer-reviewed journals is important. And hopefully this presentation gives you a little bit better understanding of why that is the case. Okay, thank you.